Hello, and welcome to the fifth episode of the Exploring Bias series. Our next speaker is Frances Kasuni, and she will be speaking about bias in art history. I hope you enjoy.
Hi, my name is Frances. I'm a senior at Granite Bay High School, and I wanted to take some time to address biases that permeate the art world and art history. I wanted to start off by talking about what happens when you make a quick Google search of famous artists. It grants you a list of Pablo Picasso, Vincent van Gogh, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Andy Warhol, and Jackson Pollock. These are all widely celebrated, widely successful artists. But what do they all have in common? They're all old white men. A study done by Smithsonian Magazine found that 85% of artists featured in prominent collections in the United States are white, while 87% are men. Despite advances as basic as those made in the Civil Rights Act to prevent bias in unemployment, or the suffragette movement and beyond, we still see massive bias in the art world. If Google employed 85% white male software engineers, then they'd have a lawsuit on their hands. But the art world gets away with it with highway robbery. Not only do white men dominate the playing field, but they dominate our history, and most notably our art history. In analyzing how bias permeates art history and the contemporary art world, I wanted to talk about three different layers. First is representation bias in art exhibitions and galleries. Second is the visual bias that is deeply ingrained in Western society. And third is the art bias in the classroom, because we're never going to have better representation without better education. So, first is representation bias in exhibitions and galleries. Look, when you put a piece of art in a museum, you aren't hiring the artist. They aren't an employee, that is. And in this way, despite well established laws against racial discrimination in the workforce, art galleries and museums have gotten away with blatant discrimination. The reason for this discrimination is more complex, and it's something that I want to address in other points, but the fact still remains that white men dominate up to 80% of wall space in the US. And that's completely absurd, and it shouldn't be the case. And it isn't just the artists and white men that dominate wall space in galleries. We found a study done by the American Alliance of Museums found that all museum hires between 2014 and 2018, of those hires, 88% of people hired for executive and conservation roles were white. Museums are supposed to be broad cultural bodies that provide and work with the community that they exist in and that they reside in. And in no way can museums as a cultural body do that with the level of bias that exists today. A report for Americans for the Arts American for the Arts found that leaders at local art agencies are 14% more white than the general US population, a number that goes up to 21% for executive directors and CEOs. Again, if the general populace and the general community in which a museum or a local art agency resides is not reflected in the body of work that's presented and those who work in the galleries, then they're never going to be reaching their full potential of what museums can be and can provide for people. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination in hiring, promotion, discharge, pay, fringe benefits, job training, classification, referral, and other aspects of employment on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Reality is, this bias, which is so noticeable and inherent to museums in the United States today, have pushed the non-executives and the non-leader workers of art museums to join the laborers that have gone on strike in increasing numbers since the COVID-19 pandemic. From the Philadelphia Museum of Art to the Massachusetts Art Museum, we've seen more and more workers strike for better diversity and for better wages, because the reality is the non-leaders and the non-executives that are more diverse are the groups who get less pay, less benefits, and worse hours. So, in a way, the Civil Rights Act saying that benefits can't be discriminated against based on race and sex really we see that bias also existing in museums today. But further, when we only have the curators and the executives of museums being white men, we're only going to see that visual bias reflected in society. In the same way that Western beauty standards define how we see and think and talk about beauty, visual biases in the art field define what we deem as good art. And in some ways, visual biases feed into the alt-right justifications for the supremacy of the Western world. Sean Illing for Vox News wrote in 2019 that alt-right groups have driven the messaging that ancient Greek and Roman cultures are the basis of Western civilization, and that these cultures are the exclusive achievements of white men. And of course, these Greek and Roman cultures are the predecessors for our art and are what we deem as good art. As we've begun to, in some ways, reverse the biases and recognize and celebrate art from different cultures, the alt-right has taken it as a sign that Western tradition is dying. There's been a lot of fear-mongering about the decline and collapse of Western civilization as we know it, and as Jordan Peterson would like to say, postmodern neo-Marxism. But that isn't how it should be. And as much as the alt-right tries to sound this alarm, we're still very much far from undoing societal biases. Even down to the layer of not only what we consider to be good art, but what we even consider to be art at all is very Eurocentric. It is deemed as good and valuable art. The way we visualize and analyze and break down art are all based on assumptions rooted in the same way that the Greeks and the neoclassics and Impressionists would consider good art. It doesn't leave a lot of room for inserting, say, Indigenous American art, Buddhist art, Hindu art, Islamic art, you name it. And all of those come in increasing an incredible variety. The fact that most designations for non-Western art are made very broad and very sweepingly, while Western art has been more granularized into movements and time periods, we don't make the effort to place importance to the visual distinctions between different time periods and different movements with the same depth and detail that we do of more Western European art. Of course, that doesn't mean that no one is studying and no one is researching the vast intricacies of non-Western art, but in general society, the bias against it is very strong. And how we value art, and especially in art history, it's very common to assess art's formal qualities. The line, shape, form, space, texture, value, and color of art. But those sweeping, broad generalizations of how we assess art are in many instances the ability for it to adhere to a more Western formalist aesthetic. Rules for making good art are very much still ingrained in the visual biases of Western audiences. There's a Eurocentric vision of the evolution of art from Egypt to Greece to Rome, culminating in European art. But that doesn't take into consideration the unique artistic evolution and contribution of China, India, Nigeria, South Africa, Japan, Islamic art, Buddhist art, Hindu art, to name a few. A study published in Frontiers in Psychology journal said that, called Aesthetic Preferences for Eastern and Western Traditional Visual Art, found that Chinese participants gave higher aesthetic scores to traditional Chinese painting than to Western painting, and that Western participants tended to give higher aesthetic scores to traditional Western paintings than to Chinese paintings. And with a significant portion of the richest and largest museums being in the West, we see an inherent bias towards Western art ingrained not only in our museums, but in our society. We will never be able to undo that if we don't undo the educational bias in art history. Let's look to the AP Art History curriculum. It's one of the most widely taught art history classes in high school. The art history curriculum has vied to get more non-Western art as a part of the education, but to the point where non-Western art isn't yet ingrained in our textbooks and isn't yet taught to our teachers, we are never going to have a more diverse art history curriculum. Education in the classroom will only be as good as how the teacher was trained and how the textbook integrates materials from non-Western sources. There are a limited number of questions that pertain to non-Western art on the AP exam. And while it is a part and it is a role, it's a minor one. And when the motivation of an AP class is to pass the AP exam, teachers and textbooks have sidestepped non-Western art. Denise Michelle Cornish wrote her thesis at Sac State called Mourning Women, Headless Monsters, and Passive Goddesses. She explored how art history education and materials have perpetuated white male bias. She found that in most textbooks that taught AP art history in US classrooms, the textbook writing was viewed as very traditional, with stereotypical images consisting of active male gods, heroes, and athletes, along with mourning women, headless female monsters, and passive goddesses. And more broadly, they did not include more racial diversity. But most importantly, Denise Michelle Cornish notes that textbooks have an incentive to appeal to the teachers and the biases of schools. There's a competitive focus on providing high school students with introductory college art curriculums, and it's driven by the textbook's publisher's ability to sell what parents and schools will buy. And in that sense, it reflects these bias that is so ingrained in society visually and in museums. As much as there's been a massive push for museums to be more diverse and to have art from different sources, it's slow. It's going to take a long time, and you're going to have to unwind biases at every level. The employment biases, the visual biases, and the educational biases. I look forward to a time that when you search Google for famous artists, you'll be met not only with a list of white men, but with a list of Frida Kahlo, Maya Lin, Mary Cassatt, Yayoi Kusama, Cindy Sherman, and Julie Meritou. Thank you for your time, and I hope this was informational and helpful. Thank you.